Yeah, thanks for coming out. It's nice to see everybody. I'll give a quick rundown as well to sort of talk about where I've been, and then I was thinking of framing this around sort of things that really helped me out when I was starting out in my career and going through my career, many of which I learned right here at Webster. Some things that I wish I would have known or maybe learned a little bit too late, and then some thoughts as well. Now that I'm doing a lot of hiring in journalism roles and media roles, sort of what I'm looking for and everything like that, and then want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers as well. And as always, if you have a question and we don't get to it at the end, you can always email me. I'll give out my email address. Always happy to talk with folks too. Just to get started, where I came from. So I am class of '07 here from Webster. After graduating that May, I had 2 part-time media jobs. One was at KMOX Radio, the big AM radio station here, where I was a producer, largely behind the scenes, a few overnight shifts, that sort of thing. The kind of very typical entry-level, starting out in radio type of job. I knew that I wanted to work in audio somewhere. I was really focused on public radio. I was also interested in sort of arts journalism, documentary filmmaking, and all of that, but had really gravitated by the time I graduated toward working in public radio. And KMOX, while not public radio, was a job in audio. I was interested in it, so I went there. I was not reporting though, and so to continue reporting, I was working for a local news blog called pubdef.net, which was covering politics in St. Louis City. So I worked there as well, cutting videos and then also writing the occasional story. In the very beginning of 2008, got a job at Louisville Public Media, which is a consortium of 3 public radio stations in Louisville, Kentucky. So I was doing that. Oh, fantastic. It's all mapped out here. Thank you. All right. So yeah, Louisville Public Media is... Thank you. And I started out there as a reporter, and one of the conditions of the job was that I would also need to host on Saturday mornings, just sort of doing the ins and outs, giving the newscasts and everything for local news. So I was happy to take it. I gladly did. I really wanted to focus on reporting. Hosting was something that I ended up really enjoying quite a bit. But after a few years of doing that and sort of consistently talking to my boss about how we needed to be doing more online, I became the online editor. From there, I became news director, and then eventually program and news director in sort of a combined role, and ended up spending about 6 years there. Did the Neiman Fellowship, which, yes, is great. It's a year of school, but the grades don't really matter, and you're around 23 of the most intimidatingly accomplished journalists in the world. People who've reported from war zones, people who have been finalists for Pulitzer year after year, so it's great just to spend some time with them. They caught a picture of me laughing for some reason, so I thought I'd include that, but there's a lot of laughter. Went to National Geographic for a year and a half, working on the digital editorial side, and then went to WAMU to work on a show called 1A that was a new public radio show that they were starting. It was the type of opportunity that really I couldn't pass up, because starting a new 2-hour broadcast show that would air nationwide on public radio is a pretty rare thing. Those slots don't always open up, so being able to go in and really have a hand in the creation of that show was a great opportunity. And what I was doing there, apart from helping to set the editorial direction, was I was working on managing the digital and social outreach. And part of our mandate was we were replacing a show that used to take live calls every day, and our goal was to be a call-in show without calls. So we were trying to sort of figure that out and come up with ways to approximate that, to use social media, to use other tools that we could to reach an audience who really didn't want to dial into their landline and talk to a public radio show, or who maybe didn't want to listen to a public radio show live. So how could we reach people and include their voices in the show if we weren't broadcasting at a time when they were going to be calling in? After being at 1A, which was produced by WAMU, I went to the WAMU newsroom and was managing all audio news for a period of time. And then went to Here and Now, produced by WBUR, airing on NPR stations across the country. I still work remotely from Washington, but Here and Now is NPR's midday show. I know St. Louis has started broadcasting it in the middle of the day right now, so that's where you can hear what I'm up to. And now I'm back at Webster. So a few things that helped me out that I'd like to talk about early on. technical skills are something that is kind of easy to overlook at times, of just sort of, do you know how to use the software? Do you know how the hardware works? That sort of thing. But early on in my career, that was extremely beneficial. A number of times I had applied for jobs and was sort of told after getting an offer, it was down to, me and one or two other people, and what changed, what pushed it over the line was I knew how to write HTML decently. I knew how to edit video, that sort of thing. Like having that additional level of skill on the resume and being able to talk about not only knowing how to do it, but how to incorporate it into the work that we're doing already, ended up really pushing me over the line there. So it's important, I think, to have those skills and just really know the tools that you're using in the job really well. Even still, I think working in radio, a lot of people have very good audio skills, and that's something that can easily be taken for granted, especially early on. There's a lot of sort of intricate audio work. Knowing how digital sound files work, knowing how the studios work, really can give you a leg up when you're working in a field like that. So if you're looking at going into some place that is really focused on a particular technology or a particular medium, really knowing the ins and outs of that medium and making that clear on your resume will definitely help not only get a job, but then help you when you're working on it. The other thing, just sort of from a personal side, when you really know how the tools work or how the technology works, I find this especially with audio, you can play around with it, have a little more fun, experiment more, and experiment more successfully as well, sort of knowing like the capabilities of the medium that you're working in. Knowing people, making connections is always important. I'm sure you've heard it a lot. Networking is crucial, but also just knowing who to reach out to for advice. I still reach out to a lot of people and just think like, oh, I'm at this stage of my career, what am I doing? Or bouncing ideas around with people. But early on, especially, the job in Louisville was one where I knew somebody who knew somebody in Louisville. It wasn't the best connection possible, but I said, can you just put in a good word? And now that I'm hiring as well, I'll get recommendations. Knowing people helps. It won't always get you the job, but it does help someone look at your resume a second time, which is really important. A lot of times with hiring, especially when it's sort of the digital hiring process, the hiring manager is going to be getting dozens upon dozens of resumes. A lot of them are not even from people in media. A lot of times those accounts get spammed, that sort of thing. So it's really helpful just to get a word of, oh, hey, this person, like, take a look at their resume. And people usually do. They'll give it a second look. So if you have a strong resume, it's a good way to get a second look there. Also, just introducing yourself to people as well. If you're applying somewhere and you don't know someone, I very often will just get emails out of the blue from someone saying, even if we don't have an opening, of, I'd like to work on Here and Now someday. I'd like to work at 1A someday. What can you tell me? That sort of thing. And I am always happy just to hop on and, have like a 20, 30-minute Zoom call with somebody just to talk about, what's it like, especially students as well. So I think that's something you can always do. If there's some place that you're interested in working, just reach out, see who might be available, learn a bit more about them, get on their radar. It's also helpful a lot to figure out if you don't want to work someplace. I sometimes will get calls or hear from people who say, oh, I'm thinking of working, for public radio, and they'll learn, how a show works versus how a reporting unit works, and maybe sometimes make a decision of, oh, I'd rather be a reporter than a producer on a show, that sort of thing. So it's always good to reach out and have those conversations. Good writing skills are just so important, especially if you're, cold emailing people to ask them about what they're doing when you're applying or anything, and also when you're starting to file your first stories. Just having really clear, really good writing abilities gets overlooked a lot, but is really going to help not only in effective communication when you're applying, but also in doing the job. We're still based around writing, even if it's audio, even if it's video, anything like that. So just being able to really turn in really clean copy once you have a job is going to really help. And also handling rejection. I mean, it's the sad thing. I do a fair amount of freelancing too, and probably get 10 rejections for every acceptance in a good round of pitching. And it doesn't mean that the idea is bad. And that's one thing that it really took me a long time to learn when I was trying to freelance and when I was pitching projects. And even now in my job, when I pitch a project to my boss of, maybe we ought to do this. A lot of times it gets turned down. And I think the thing to realize is it's not a fault necessarily with the idea. Maybe it's not the right time. Maybe you're not pitching the right outlet. Maybe there's some refinement. But I think that whenever there is a rejection like that, you can always sort of use it to sharpen the idea, turn it into something else. There have been plenty of times that I've pitched something, it's been turned down, and I've thought, oh, well, this idea was no good. 6 months later, I see something very similar published somewhere else, and it's like, oh, I see what they did that made it work. And had I stuck with the idea, had I worked on it a little bit more, then maybe it could have taken off. So just knowing how to handle that is always really important. Some things I wish I knew. When I started in Louisville, I had this idea of, oh, I'll move here, I'll do some reporting, I'm a good reporter. That's enough. But it's not. If you're reporting somewhere, really get yourself into the community, get yourself into what's going on, learn as much as you possibly can about it. I remember hearing stories when I was a student of essentially saying, somebody gets a job in a new market and they say, oh, can you send me the front page of the daily paper for the last 2 weeks so they could really read up, that sort of thing. Well, you could do it online, so go for it. And then when you get to a place where you're reporting, even if it's just like a one-off assignment somewhere, just really go in and learn as much as you can, talk to people, build up sources, build up connections, learn to understand what you're reporting on. If it's a local community, go places. If it's a specific topic, if you get a job writing about, the defense industry, then just learn how it works really well and learn who's who, make connections with people and everything, because that's really going to help. And it's something that's very easy to overlook, that I overlooked a lot when I was starting out. Because I thought, oh yeah, I'm following the news here in Louisville, but I wasn't going out that often to just sort of, sit in a coffee shop, hear what people are talking about, meeting new people, that sort of thing. Speaking up effectively as well. There were a lot of times I would get an assignment or didn't like the angle of a story and didn't really know how to react to that. And other times when, workplaces are always going to have some challenges, so knowing how to speak up whenever you see something like a colleague that might be getting burnt out or not being treated fairly or a story angle that you don't think is appropriate, being able to just sort of say, maybe we should try this approach, maybe we should use this language, I'm concerned about this person, that sort of thing. Being able to reach out, to speak up and offer a solution is really, really essential. Don't just let things sort of slide by if they're bothering you. If you see something either internally or with coverage, being able to offer a solution, being able to offer a better way to do it is important. And people listen if you say, this is how we ought to be approaching this story. I think this is the angle that we should be approaching the story with. And it often works. I think a lot of times there's just oversight that happens, especially in a daily news environment. One example I can use recently is, every day we're talking about sources for the show, who we're going to have on, and every day in the news meeting for Here and Now, usually somebody might bring up, oh, is this really the best voice here? Are we really getting at the story best? Or maybe we should try this angle. And it always works. If there's another angle, speak up. I think I was definitely too shy for the first few years of my career and didn't bring things up when I thought I should have. And I really should have. So I think having that confidence and that ability to offer an alternate way of coverage, an alternate use of language is really important. How to tell a fad from a trend. This is a kind of strange one, but I wanted to include it because I think distilling what it is important. That especially within organizations, media organizations now, a lot of them aren't in great financial shape, and they're always looking for the thing that's going to be next. And that leads to a lot of hopping on the thing that is of the second at the detriment of doing something that is going to work in the long term. And so one example I would use is telling a fad from a trend. A fad might be the individual app that does something, but a trend is the overall arc of it. And I think you can look right now, we saw a few years ago this sort of disastrous, quote unquote, pivot to video that a lot of media organizations did. But we could see that video was catching on, that it was something that people were doing. It was starting as far back as a decade ago when the first sort of pretty good live streaming apps came along, and then Vine and everything like that. And I think a lot of media organizations really bet everything on one specific platform instead of trying to think of how can we make our work nimble enough to fit onto whichever platform is going to be coming next. So starting to understand kind of what's behind those things is important. And I think early on I especially was like, no, we have to be doing this. We have to be doing, trying to think of what the big trends were in those early days, but like early Facebook video, early YouTube experiments and everything. And it's like, I was really advocating for a digital change, but one that was not super effective because I was pushing for betting everything on a specific platform rather than on the direction that media might be going in. Another thing, be enthusiastic about your hobbies. I freelance a lot about things I'm interested in, which is great because usually if you're into something, there's other people who are going to be into it. But also don't feel a pressure to make them your job. I early on especially really burned myself out by trying to turn everything I was interested in into an opportunity for journalism and didn't really carve out that space for myself. And not doing that is something that led to just a lot of kind of rough weeks sometimes of like just investing everything in work and not thinking about what are things for me and then also what are things I'm interested in that I can share sort of a love for and appreciation for. Talking about money is another thing that is really important and something I still am a little bit reticent about sometimes with jobs, but because it's difficult, it's awkward. But the thing is, you're looking for a job, jobs pay you money, and you want to make money. You need to make money to live. So ask when it comes up. I often will, I field requests for raises pretty often, and I'm always happy to hear it. But whenever I'm applying for a job and thinking about the salary, get those conversations out early. More places are starting to post salaries, get comfortable with negotiating, find ways to sort of get negotiating skills as well, which is really helpful. I'll say at Neiman, there's a class at the end, sort of a seminar on how to effectively negotiate. And they brought in some, pretty high-profile business-type folks. This is one of the most popular things that we had for the entire year, is just how to be able to effectively negotiate. So talk about money, especially when you're starting a new job. Raises, a lot of the time, are percentage-based. There might be a 3% raise or an annual 2.5% increase. So if you can go in making more, that's going to be good. Also, talk about what you make with colleagues as well. I think oftentimes colleagues are more open to talking about it. This is something that's changed in the 15 years I've been working in media. They can't stop you from talking about your salary. Some organizations will say, like, you're not supposed to talk about your pay with others. That's illegal. So talk about it. I've had situations before where somebody doing the same job as me, we've both sort of worked together to think, like, what should we be asking for? How can we ask for a raise? That sort of thing. So really talk about it up front. I have never resented anyone for negotiating when hiring for a higher salary, anything like that. Like, I haven't held it against anybody. Work boundaries too. Like I'd said earlier about hobbies, you really want to do a good job, you want to do a lot of great work, but know your limits as well. Know the hours that you're working. Talk about that up front with your boss or with whoever's hiring of, what are the hours for this job? What are the expectations for extra work? There's always going to be days whenever you have to work a little bit later to cover some breaking news or something happens, but just being able to really work that out is important. And I think especially after the sort of wave that we're still in of unionizations and union drives at workplaces, there's been a lot more conscientiousness about hours. And it is really tempting. I myself extremely guilty of this, of early on just like working all the time, always staying late. But what happens is, the reaction I got from supervisors was generally, are you okay? Take some time off. You seem really tired, that sort of thing. So it'll either cause concern or potentially people might just take advantage of it and think like, oh, here's the person who'll always work the extra hours. So do a good job, but just know the boundaries of work as well, which is something I really took too long to do. And then talking about hiring, what I look for when I'm hiring, every so often, in various jobs, I've been fortunate enough to be the hiring manager for a position. And I always look for somebody, I'm going to take these a little bit out of order, but somebody who's ready to do the job with a little bit of training. Everyone's going to need some training for any position they go into, but just sort of knowing the basic parameters of what the work is and who might be able to book a guest for a show, write a really good story, that sort of thing. Like someone who knows how to do that and won't need to do a ton of learning on the job. Everyone's going to learn on the job. Everyone's going to get trained. That's expected. But knowing how to do the basics is really important. But also I'm looking for people who have fresh ideas, who have new story ideas, new angles we might be going with, new places where we could take our coverage, new audiences we could reach, that sort of thing. So somebody who really is just going to bring in new perspectives, new ideas, new directions, new energy. Because any team, especially now, teams are getting a lot smaller and a little bit more closely knit. And so you're thinking about, at least when I'm hiring, how's this person contributing to the overall direction of what we're doing? How's this person, how are they going to fit in with the entire team and really push us into a further great direction? And then also a plan for growth and learning. I think, it's always great to come in and know how to do a job, and if you're happy being a reporter, to be a reporter for a long time. But I always like when I'm hearing from someone with hiring who will say something along the lines of like, oh, I'd like to do this in a few years and this in a few years, sort of have that idea for how they're going to grow in the role and end up growing what we're doing as well, which I think is really important. So that's the basics of what I'm looking for whenever I am hiring. And then I wanted to put this last one in, because if you follow media news, you do see layoffs happen a lot, places close down, hiring freezes might happen. That's kind of long-standing. I remember when I was applying to jobs a number of times early on, I would get an email back and say, thanks for your application, we're now under a hiring freeze, we'll get back to you in 3 months, that sort of thing. But don't get discouraged, because there are jobs out there and there is good work that can be done. So finding a good fit is really essential. Looking around, I was definitely the type of person applying for jobs who would just blanket my resume, like get it everywhere. Whoever would take me, I'll go with. And I lucked out in finding a place that was a really good fit. So I think doing that research, reaching out to places, learning a little bit more about their mission, their culture, all of that is going to be really important. And also just lead to a really better feeling day to day of doing the work. Again, know the limits of it. If there are red flags that can come up, I talk to people who have had really frustrating jobs, and most of the time when I talk to someone who has, left a job after being extremely burnt out or extremely frustrated, one thing they say is the red flags were there in the hiring process, that they were asked a lot about just sort of things that maybe cross some of their personal boundaries as far as the work that they would be doing. So knowing that part of it, I'm also a big fan. I mean, I've worked in local public media for a long time. Looking for local newsrooms, looking for nonprofit newsrooms, it's really a place of growth. It's a place without a lot of downsizing happening right now. So when you're looking for places that might be a good fit, really look at community and local journalism. It's an extremely valuable, extremely important sort of grassroots type of media, and it's often someplace that's growing. You'd be really surprised. I thought when I went to Louisville, I'll be here a couple of years, tiny little station, and leave. It's now a huge station. Like the investment of local people supporting good work in the nonprofit sector is tremendous and has been extremely beneficial. So that's a good place to look. And don't be afraid to ask. And I mean that extremely generally. In this fragmented time that we have in media, a lot of places are sustaining themselves on fairly small but connected audiences. There's a lot of really interesting newsrooms that have, Discord servers for what they're doing, or their writers are extremely accessible, or their editors are posting their email addresses publicly. Just reach out, ask people, ask, hey, will you take a look at this? Or, hey, do you think you might be hiring? That sort of thing. Like, every time that I haven't reached out to someone to ask about something, I've regretted it. And every time that I have, the worst that'll happen is they won't reply. And then you can just move on. So nothing lost except, 10, 15 minutes composing an email. But if they do reply, it's great. It might really lead to something. Even to the point of when I've been reporting, I've reached out to people who have a pretty large following and say, hey, will you check out this story? I think you might like it. They end up sharing it out. It gets a lot more attention. It gets a lot more activity, that sort of thing. So never be afraid just to reach out and ask somebody. When I started, because I'd been covering city politics in St. Louis, they put me on the city and state politics beat. And I really, really enjoyed local government reporting, which completely surprised me because I think, even like my junior year of undergrad, I would not have ever thought that I would be somebody who like just really loved being at City Hall and chasing down council members or posing questions to the mayor, that sort of thing. So that was one thing that I really liked. I also had gone into school wanting to do arts reporting and culture reporting, and over time sort of built up the confidence to pitch those stories. But yeah, I think local politics was just something I was really interested in. Try different things out to see, like, is this what I'd want to do? Like I said, I was interested in documentary filmmaking, and so I had taken a course, had worked on it, and then thought, maybe this isn't really for me. This isn't something that I want to end up doing long term. So just trying different things out, seeing what you like, and then also I was, seeing where jobs were available, and ended up where I ended up. Honestly, like activities, I was in student government, I was in a number of clubs, I took classes outside of my major whenever I could, but I think that sort of student government and club involvement was really helpful. I think that more than anything else built up skills that I'm using now quite a bit of interpersonal communication, managing a small group. Even some budgeting was involved in some of the clubs and everything, but I think just having that involvement, apart from it being fun, it ended up really paying off, and just knowing how to work with people, how to kind of build consensus, work on ideas, how to run meetings. A lot of any job you're going to get is probably going to involve meetings. So knowing how to sort of make them the most effective and everything. So yeah, I think all those, just involvement, student government in various clubs was really good. And then also, I don't know, just throughout my work, I'll often kind of think of something that I picked up in a class that was totally outside my major and think like, oh, this is really good. Like I know how to do a certain type of math, or I know a certain like historical approach to something from taking like a history course, that sort of thing, which is always extremely beneficial to know. So the way that it worked for me in Louisville was, I'd really been advocating that we needed to be doing more online, and I had presented plans on what we could be doing, what my role in that would be, and that was just a way of getting like a little bit more responsibility. But then as far as the promotion sort of from online editor to news director went, it was seeing that there was an opportunity, seeing that there was an opening. People were coming in and interviewing for the job, and I thought, it might be a long shot. Maybe this is something I would be interested in, and just had a really honest conversation with my boss at the time. We had over time built up a pretty good relationship of just having a pretty good rapport, talking about the work that I was doing, that sort of thing. So just having that sort of ability to feel like I could reach out and have that conversation of, hey, I'm interested in this position. I understand if it's not the right fit. If it's not, is there something else I could be moving up to, that sort of thing. So that I think was the most important part. Does that answer the question? Like just kind of like built that relationship, and then showed that I could do it. Like had ideas for what I would do. I think the thing that I hadn't anticipated as much is what the responsibilities of managing are, and so really showing that I was willing to do that for that job, or maybe for a promotion after. I remember even like talking about like, well, here's a workshop that's going to help. Like here's a training I can get into, that sort of thing. And that was really beneficial as well, of just sort of saying like, I understand, like, here's where I think I would excel at this job. Here's where I might be lacking. Here's how I plan to fill in that gap. And that ended up being really beneficial. Some of the great photographers or visual journalists I've worked with have usually approached with a pretty clear plan for collaborating, that they say, like, here's something with great visuals that I want to do. And they'll have done, a little bit of groundwork already and said, oh, and here's where the narrative of the story could be, or here's what it is. Without necessarily pitching that they would be the ones to write it, that they would, be fully under the expectation of, pair me with a reporter, I'll provide the art, and the contacts and everything, and sort of work with the reporter. So I think coming in with that sort of like clear groundwork for collaboration tends to work really well, and then demonstrating that too. I think if you have if you are a visual journalist now, like finding somebody who might be more focused on writing and work together on something where they're maybe providing the text, you're providing the visuals, And having that in your resume, I think, is really great, of just kind of showing, like, bring me in, this is what I'll be able to do. And I think also a lot of people are really keen to work with great visual journalists as well, because we're sort of on, 15 years of asking a reporter to take a picture on their phone that's not going to be that great. So I think there is like a real hunger for somebody to work with somebody else like that. So it varies sometimes. When I'm interviewing for jobs, I always try to find if there is an opportunity kind of early on when we're talking about money, we're talking about other sort of sides of the job, to put in a question of, and what are the hours? What are the expectations here? And then I'll sort of put my boundaries in there. But I think a good time to do it as well. Then when I'm hiring, I'm trying to like sort of make it clear what the hours are going to be. But I think just asking, in an interview, what are the hours, what are the expectations for this job, and that point that you have in every interview of, any questions for us? A few substantive questions about what the role is, and then I think a technical question like that is always pretty welcome and goes a long way. And then as far as like actually being in the job and communicating that, I think just if you're being asked consistently to work extra hours or to respond to things, I think just saying, hey, you've asked me to work, past 6 o'clock several times. Can I take some comp hours here? Can I do something else? Will just essentially remind that person who's assigning you, like, they need to be thinking about this a little bit differently. And then the quiet quitting thing is really interesting to have been following because, I don't know, and maybe this is part of just like the benefit of kind of working in a really understanding workplace of it. The result of quiet quitting is just what we used to call working, I think, of like, you have a job, a certain number of hours, it's done, then you're off the clock. And I think that to a degree, I was just talking about this with Larry before, like the pandemic has really changed that. I think early on there was an expectation of we're all working from home, we're living at work, it's kind of a constant push and pull. But I think now there is much more of a feeling of, among everybody, of like, we're on Zoom 8 hours a day. Can we log off? Can we have our personal time? Can we shut down? So I think one good way of kind of establishing those boundaries is just to follow them and to not respond to emails after a certain point and everything. There can be pressure to do that, but I also think like raising that conversation of, hey, you sent me an email at 8:30 yesterday. I didn't get to it until 9 o'clock today when I logged on. What is the expectation here? Should I be replying to it? That sort of thing. Because I think there's still a lot of people who really like to send emails at off hours just because that's when they're thinking about it and doing it. But I also think that that's starting to change quite a bit. The last few places I've worked, people have generally tried to avoid that or have also set up their communications preferences really quickly or really early on. Like whenever someone's starting now, I try to have this conversation with them. And I think this is something you can have when you're starting out as well, of just saying, here's how I like to communicate during the workday. Workplace is probably using Slack, Zoom, email, that sort of thing. And then I'll talk with people and say, after hours, if there's an emergency, what's the best way to reach you? I'll let people know Slack notifications are off after 5 o'clock. Text me if you need anything, that sort of thing. So I think like even framing it in that way of like how to communicate after hours and reminding people there is an after hours is really important. I usually log on around 7:30 in the morning, and I have a meeting with our senior managing editor and our executive producer, and the three of us look at what we have planned for the show. Some segments are already done and sort of pre-recorded and ready to go, like feature stories and everything, that we're talking about how we want to, first, what big stories we want to cover of the day, and then how we're going to cover it. Do we have a reporter in Ukraine? Do we have a reporter in Florida? How are we going to get at this? What is our angle going to be? And then we'll start really building out those details. So we do that at 7:30. At 8 o'clock is everybody meets for the morning editorial meeting. The hosts are there. Every producer is there. We run through the show. We make assignments for producers and figure out, and then that's also where we kind of sharpen the angles of the stories that we've just come up with that we put on the board at 7:30. Talk with producers. Everybody weighs in and sort of offers ideas on angles of the show, angles of stories and everything, guests that we can get to. And from there, we're off and running, putting the show together, usually by about 8:30 each day. The senior staff, which I'm on, we meet around 8:45 to divide up editing responsibilities, additional things for the day. We go over story pitches that people have sent in. The show starts at noon. It goes live from noon to 2. So in the time between 8:30 and essentially 2 o'clock, I'm responsible for editing all the stories that air in the second hour of the show, and then listening to the finished recordings, approving them, getting them on air, reading over the final details and everything, talking with the producers, and all that. The producers, meanwhile, are booking guests, recording interviews, getting people in live, writing the scripts, and whenever they're done, they'll send them along to me to look at and approve and everything. After the show, we always have another editorial meeting where we do a little bit of postmortem on the show. What worked, what didn't, do we need to update anything? The way that a lot of the NPR shows work is they'll air for 2 hours and then they roll over for 2 hours, so other time zones can carry them. Stations that might be airing something else that time can air it again. And if any news changes, if there are any errors that we need to correct, then we'll do those updates sort of after 2 o'clock to make sure that everything's up to date. And then I usually am meeting with the different people I manage, that sort of thing, and working on that till the end of the day. There's about 5 or so people who are always in Boston at the station there, and then the rest of us are on Zoom. One of our hosts, Scott, is in the NPR building in DC with a producer. Our other host, Deepa, who is debuting on air next week, is based in San Francisco, so she'll be joining in there. Not to focus on the negative, I'll start with disadvantages. It is a little bit harder to communicate at times, especially on like a strict deadline. Sometimes, if I have to get word to the studio, I'll just call someone who's in the building and ask them. That's the thing that I think has taken the most adjustment since the pandemic is like returning to the phone part of our phones and using them just to call people, talk things through, that sort of thing. Which also goes back to the communications preferences too of just saying, like, if you need to reach me urgently during the day, here's how to do it, that sort of thing. So I have a note open on my work computer all the time with the phone numbers of the people who I need to call quickly, and also just how they prefer to know about things. Because some people, based on their job, it might be easier to reach them on Slack, that sort of thing. So so communication, it just takes a little bit of figuring out. One advantage is we're a national show, and we have producers, in every time zone, every region of the country, and hosts on both coasts. So being able to sort of really reflect that the geography of the country and have people kind of all over the place is really, really beneficial. So often, someone might say, "Oh, I've noticed this issue around me. Let's do a story on it," and we'll end up building something out that that otherwise we just wouldn't have known about at all, or that might seem like too much of a local story or something like that. But yeah, having like a staff that's more spread out, we're able to really see, to really reflect that just what's happening across the country. One of our senior editors and occasional hosts is based in Phoenix and has done some great reporting on the water crisis in the West. And he'll travel around sort of all over the Mountain West area to like report on different things, some of the midterm elections and all that. So it really does help out just having more people across the country that way. Don't have your workstation be your kitchen table. It took me about a year of the pandemic to realize that because it's always there. And there is a temptation to sort of do that. If you're fortunate, bless you, if you're fortunate enough to have the space, then having like a separate room or a separate area is really helpful because you're able to sort of log off, step away, that sort of thing. Other good things to know though is, again, just like calling people, reaching out to people. I tend to be kind of shy in general, so I don't like always start conversations, but and so sometimes I really need to push myself too. So I think if you're starting a job that's remote, just reaching out, saying hi to people, DMing on Slack, sending an email, setting up a time to talk on Zoom is really, really helpful, like just starting those conversations. And the same way that you would if you were in an office, getting to know people, try to do something that replicates that, walking by somebody's desk 4 or 5 times a day when you're going to get water or coffee, that sort of thing. Like just building up that additional time to have like a little bit of face time or a little bit of like communication time with people is tremendously helpful. a number of people who've applied for jobs who say like, how do you deal with tough personalities and that sort of thing? And I think, yeah, the best follow-up is like, well, what do you mean by that? Because I think that usually is a sign of like, maybe somebody is a bad communicator. Maybe there's just somebody who's like, if not toxic, like sort of on that borderline, that somebody who needs to be worked around, that sort of thing. So I think if questions like that start coming up, that could be a red flag. And I think also just if something seems like a red flag in an interview, just asking a follow-up like that is always good of like, yeah, like what do you mean working with difficult people? Or, yeah, because I think sometimes in hiring, the person interviewing can sometimes maybe reveal a bit about like their own concerns with the work and thinking about like, yeah, like how do you handle this? How do you handle that? Like generally the hypotheticals will get thrown out, and asking for some clarification on those of like, well, has that really happened is always good. But yeah, I think those are some of them. But yeah, apart from the difficult people one, I think just if the questions really, really venture outside of the basic job description, that's sometimes kind of a concern, because it could be a sign that they're really expecting this job to be doing 2 or 3 other jobs as well. And a few points I got at could maybe be distilled into this idea of like learning how to manage up is such a challenge, and something that is it comes along with practice, but knowing some of the best practices there of offering a solution and also like having the receipts basically of like, this is my job description. I just spent X number of hours in the last week doing things that were not part of this job description. We need to talk about what. Either revising the job description, at which point you could work with your supervisor to figure that out, a change in compensation, or for them to stop asking you to do other things that aren't part of the job. I always kind of bristle at this whenever I'd heard it of like, don't bring up a problem without a solution, because it can be frustrating. And I think especially when I've been like at a like sort of lower seniority type of job, like the idea of like, why do I have to come up with the solution? I'm not the one running things. Like, but it is helpful to like. And also can usually be a really good way of just kind of asserting like what you'd rather be doing as well. Of like, hey, I'm being asked to do this. I think I should be doing this for these reasons, that sort of thing. So basically just like presenting as much of a plan whenever possible, and bringing that up is always key. I definitely try to, when I'm editing a story with someone, whether it's an audio story or text story or any format, of sort of saying like, this needs to change, here's how we could do it. This needs to change, here's how we could do it. A lot of editors don't do that. So I think that if you get feedback that is just like, well, this isn't going to work, this isn't, then asking the question of like, well, what will it take to get it to the point of working? And maybe that means that, you have to set up a meeting for, 30 minutes the next week or something to talk about it and put it off a bit. But just making sure that you can get that feedback of, why was this decision made, and then how can it be addressed? And possibly the answer is like, we don't have time to do this, and then figuring out a way sort of around that, like working on solutions and outside of sort of that conversation might be necessary. But I think just always asking, because I think a good editor should provide the feedback of like, here's what needs to change for this to be ready to go. But if they don't, then just asking and sort of having that conversation, knowing that it might not happen immediately, but that it should happen is always key. So I've accepted a couple jobs, the job in Louisville, the job at National Geographic that involved moving and relocation. And one, I will say early on now that I'm in a position where we are hiring people who will work remotely, that tends to be a question that comes up pretty early of like, does this require relocation? I think having that conversation with them when you're applying and when the offer comes through of, this is, like letting them know, they understand if they're making the offer that a relocation is going to happen. So asking for a relocation allowance, which some places provide, where they'll give you a little bit of money for the move. That's something that I've seen some companies now just no longer offer, but then what can be offered instead is a boost in the salary, that sort of thing, and then just making sure that it fits what you want to do, that you're going to be happy there, that you're going to be, willing to do the move, and then also building in the timeline for it as well. That if somebody's hiring you and they're expecting you to move from St. Louis to Texas, letting them know, like, I'm going to need this much time, and it's all going to be a negotiation. But I think just going through of what support can you provide for moving, what support can you provide for X, Y, or Z. I'll say when I was moving to Louisville for the job, there was a relocation allowance, a small one, but that was nice to hear. But also, I'd reached out and just said, where should I look for a place to live? What advice would you have? And generally, it's all local people working there. And I got back a really nice email with suggestions from like half the staff of like, oh, this is a great neighborhood. This is an area you ought to check out, that sort of thing. So yeah, I would say just making sure that you're negotiating the terms of the move as much as you can. Ask for a relocation allowance. If they don't do a relocation allowance, ask if there might be a bump in salary to accommodate that. It could be no, but you'll have to decide what you'll accept. But it doesn't hurt to ask in those situations because they know that you're moving. And then take some time to go visit as well and make sure it's a place that you want to be. There have been a few times that I've pitched stories. Let me think of a good one. Yeah, well, I'll share one now. I had been so when I did the Nieman Fellowship, I was studying nostalgia in popular culture and politics, and this sort of like view of the past and how it's shaping things, and have worked that up over time into a book proposal I'm sending around, and it is a lot of rejections. And it's very easy, at this point where I would just say like, oh, I'm done with this. But after sort of like each round, I am working with an agent in this point, and we'll sort of like talk and set up a call. Like I start to lose hope, and then I'm like, don't do that. Let me figure this out. And so we'll set up a call and sort of like go over the rejection letters together, figure out, what needs to change with this proposal, who else might be more interested. And in that process, which we're still sort of like working through, it has really helped in kind of figuring out like, where is the best place to pitch this? Where is a place that's really going to take this? And even in sort of like my freelance article writing career, I've really been focused, like I'll write for one publication for a few articles. And what usually happens there is the first one that they take is something that's been turned down elsewhere, that I'll like, I'll start and say like, oh, well, this place would be perfect. And they'll say, no, thank you. So I'll revise the idea a little bit, look for someplace else, and just sort of like revise with each rejection basically until I find someplace. And then once I find someplace that takes it, then usually in the course of, going through the editing process, getting the piece together, I'll start having conversations with the editor of, and at some point maybe bring up some other ideas, and then, 2 or 3 other stories might flow from that in the next like year or two. But yeah, I think with each rejection, just revising a little bit, finding a new place to send to is always helpful. And hopefully, not every place does this, but hopefully they will like give a little bit of feedback too, of just like, oh, it's not for us because of this, or oh, it's not for us because of this. Like that's going to vary place by place, industry by industry. But yeah, just trying to like go back and see. Yeah, I think a lot of times on first pitch something gets rejected, and then I'll revise it a little bit, think like, oh, maybe it was like a little too all-encompassing, or maybe it wasn't quite as clear like why I should be the one to write this, that sort of thing.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks, Gabe, for providing us with some great advice. It's always fun to remember that, yes, there is life after you finish at Webster. And if you have questions, we've got other speakers this week, but also your faculty is available to answer any question you have. I always like to tell students, this is a golden hour in your life. There's people that come to work to do nothing but answer your questions, and so we're here to take advantage of that while you're here. So thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.
Yeah, and if you want to reach me, my email is gbullard@gmail.com, so first initial, last name.